The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Zulovich, part of the team at Cherokee Media Group and Senior Editor of Subprime Auto Finance News. In today's webinar, the electric vehicle residual value outlook, we're going to learn more from Michael Vogon, who is the lead economist at Moodys Analytics. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. Please make sure you've dialed in using the phone number provided in your communication email, or you're able to listen via your PC speakers. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll make the recording and presentation available to you as soon as possible. You will be in listen-only mode for this webinar, but we will reserve some time after the presentation for a question and answer session. You can submit your questions at any time through the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if we aren't able to get to your question today, don't worry, because we'll forward it to the team at Moodys Analytics so they can respond back to you directly via email. And lastly, if you have any difficulty during the webinar, please click on the hand icon on the GoToWebinar control panel to alert a member of our team. So with lots of information to share, let's get right to Michael for our webinar. Michael, the floor is now yours.
Thanks a lot, Nick. So today I'm going to talk about electric vehicle residual values. And this is primarily going to be an empirical, model-driven analysis to try to understand the factors that have influenced electric vehicle residual values today and in the past, and then what those forces look like moving forward. So electric vehicles are one of the most exciting things happening in the auto industry right now. Engineers have been trying to make electric vehicles since all the way back in the 1800s, and it's only in the past 5 years that we've seen a considerable advancement in electric vehicle technology and also consumer adoption. This is evident just by looking at the variety of electric vehicles on the road. So here, battery electric vehicles are electric vehicles that are solely powered by an electrical battery. And back in 2011, you really had your choice of the Nissan Leaf, but today there's over 14 different varieties available. And plug-in hybrids are hybrid vehicles that have both a combustion engine and a small electrical engine as well. There's more than 18 of those available as of the 2017 model year. With this increase in variety of electric vehicles, there's also been an increase in new sales. New sales have grown at a 32% annual rate over the past 4 years, and many large OEMs have made a very strong commitment to the future to making more electric vehicles. California alone is shooting for 1.5 million electric vehicles on their road by 2025. So one of the most important things from a loan and lease perspective is understanding how the demand for these vehicles in the secondary market affects their prices, both to better understand collateral values and also residual value risk. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using prices from the National Automobile Dealers Association auction net data. So these are wholesale auctions from around the country. And when you look at the price to MSRP ratios between gas-powered vehicles, battery vehicles, and plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles definitely depreciate faster than gas vehicles. One thing to note up front here is that all electric vehicle MSRPs in this presentation are adjusted by the $7,500 federal tax credit. And the reason for doing that is because that tax credit mechanically depresses prices on the used market. And what we're interested in is other dynamics that influence how the depreciation rate progresses relative to the market value of the car when new. And here, this graph shows on the x-axis the age defined as year since model year. So 0 is a car sold in its model year, 1 is the year after the model year. And battery electric vehicles depreciate very quickly. By 3 years old, they're at roughly around 30% of the tax credit adjusted MSRP. And it's worth noting that that MSRP adjustment affects cheaper vehicles more than more expensive vehicles, simply because the tax credit isn't sliding with MSRP. So for a low MSRP car, that can inflate the price MSRP ratio by about 15 percentage points on average. And for a high MSRP car, it's only about 5 percentage points. But all else equal, even considering that adjustment, battery electric vehicles lose their value very quickly. And relative to plug-in hybrids, that makes sense simply because the pure battery electric vehicles, that's a massive change in how consumers approach transportation, right? Is now you have to consider things like range and where charging stations are and whether to install a high-powered electrical volt in your house. Whereas the plug-in hybrid, you still leverage the pre-existing infrastructure to get very long range. So the point of this presentation is to understand why battery electric vehicles lose their value so quickly, and plug-in hybrid vehicles for that matter, and how those dynamics will play out during this period of intense dynamic change. So given that there were only about 450,000 electric vehicles in the US as of 2016, it's a pretty safe bet that it's not a supply factor that's pushing down prices. So my focus here is on demand drivers. So from an economist perspective, the question is what lowers demand for electric vehicles? There's a variety of things. So the first are automotive industry factors. You have the federal tax credit, and you also have state tax credits on top of that. In addition to mechanically lowering prices, that can also encourage a consumer shift from the used market into the new market, which can have downward price pressure on used electric vehicles. The other are changing consumer preferences, just the types of cars that consumers in the US, what they demand over time. Do electric vehicles, do they conform with that or do they deviate from that? There's technological factors. So range anxiety gets a lot of play in the media about electric vehicles, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Innovation-driven obsolescence. So given the rapidity of innovation right now, the question is, why would a consumer ever buy a used car when the new one might be strictly better over time? And then the other is battery degradation. So just like phones and laptops, batteries, they lose their charge capacity over time, so that might influence prices as well in the used market. And then macroeconomic factors. For electric vehicles, oil prices are the most important one that we'll emphasize going forward. So when you look at the life cycle curve of price MSRP ratios by fuel type, you see a very interesting trend that I'm going to try to explain. So the life cycle curve I'll define as the number of months since January of the model year of a given car. And for battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, there's a distinct acceleration of depreciation in the first year of life. So battery electric vehicles fall off after the first year of life very abruptly, and then they remain level. And then plug-in hybrids, they mimic that behavior, but to a lesser degree. So the two most important questions to understand electric vehicle residual values are, first, what causes that acceleration after the first year of life? And the second question is, what causes the level to remain suppressed going forward to year 2, 3, and 4? In the first year of an electric vehicle's life, mileage begins to accrue, right? Somebody buys the car new and they begin driving it. And mileage is strongly related to battery degradation. So the battery degrades based on the number of cycles that the battery is charged in, and that is highly correlated with the number of miles driven. And the empirical evidence suggests that battery electric vehicles, their prices on the used markets are much more sensitive to the marginal mileage increment than either gas vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles. So this figure shows the average price MSRP ratio by odometer reading at time of sale, but this is fixed for only 3-year-old sales to try to remove the conflation, the high correlation between mileage and age of the vehicle. But the trend is the same no matter which age cut you look at. But the battery electric vehicles, the rate of depreciation as a function of mileage is very high, up until about 40,000 miles per year. So it depreciates very quickly, and then it levels off. Whereas the plug-in hybrid vehicles are basically just a parallel shift of the gas vehicle life cycle, meaning that there are forces that depress plug-in hybrids on average, but the slope or the marginal change because of mileage is about the same as a gas vehicle. And it's not a coincidence that that convex shape of the battery electric vehicle life cycle or mileage curve, that also is the shape of battery capacity loss for electric vehicles. So some evidence from the Tesla Model S suggests that in the first 50,000 miles, it loses about 5% of its battery capacity in a convex depreciation like that, and then it levels off afterwards. So a very important observation for electric vehicles is in that first year, that those first 10, 20,000 miles on the car, that those depreciate the price much more. And whether or not that's an accurate representation of the utility lost from a degraded battery, I think is an open question. But what it does say is that the people pricing these on wholesale markets or used markets, that does matter in determining the valuation of what a used electric vehicle is worth. Another thing that happens in that first year of life is the next model year is released. Over the past 5 years, there have been great advances in electric vehicle technology. And given the federal tax credit on new cars, right, it begs the question, why would somebody buy a used electric vehicle when they could get a new one at a discounted price, right? And just looking at the example of the 2017 Chevy Bolt and 2016 Spark. So in 2016, Spark was GM's only electric vehicle. When you look at the depreciation for the 2015 gas Spark and the 2016 gas Spark, those two cars depreciated at a similar rate over the age of the vehicle. But when you look at the 2016 battery electric Spark and the 2016 battery electric Spark, at around 1 year of life, the 2016 model year suddenly sunk. And it remained at a lower level compared to the 2016 version. And the most likely explanation for that is that Chevy came out with the Bolt, right? Another fully electric vehicle. It's only about $6,000 more expensive on the MSRP, and it has over 200 miles of range. And it's also a bigger car and what I believe is a more attractive body type. But nevertheless, the point is that the availability of that on the market seems to have shifted demand away from the old Spark. And as of earlier this year, Chevy is discontinuing the production of the Spark in the U.S. So this kind of example raises the question of how much of an impact do these innovations in late model years have on old model year pricing? So to dig into that, I used our auto cycle residual value forecasting model, which is a quantitative model that forecasts residual values based on vehicle characteristics and characteristics of the economy. So what I did was I grouped electric vehicles into two groups. So the first are electric vehicles that were succeeded by a vehicle of the same electric range. So a battery type vehicle, this is obvious, it's just the range of the all electric range of the battery. For a plug-in hybrid, it's if the model was succeeded of a plug-in hybrid with the same electric range. So we're not considering improvements in the gas engine. And then the second group are vehicles that were succeeded by a model year where the electric range improved. So the model can abstract what the life cycle of those two groups looks like, all else equal. And the evidence is clear that those vehicles that are succeeded by a model year of a range improvement, they experience a depression in residual values. So said otherwise, technological innovation in the EV space in late model years can cannibalize prices of earlier model years. And the degree of that price difference gets bigger over time to the point where by the 3-year-old mark, the difference can be as much as 10 percentage points of MSRP on average. And this is a very important observation, given that all signs suggest that we're at an inflection point of electric vehicle technology right now. A lot of OEMs have made commitments to make more electric vehicles in the future. And as battery costs come down and the technology gets better and better, you have better charging infrastructure, these late model years are early model years are going to become less and less desirable over time. So something that OEMs should be aware of, and then also something that lessors and lenders should be aware of as well. So those are the primary two explanations for that sudden drop in year one, is that the incremental mileage accrual at the beginning of an electric vehicle's life is more impactful for a battery electric vehicle because of battery degradation, and then also prices get cannibalized by innovation later on down the road. Now to get into the second part of explaining that curve, which is why does the level stay so low? So this figure shows average price to MSRP ratios for one-year-old sales by manufacturer. And what the chart shows is first that plug-in hybrids almost universally retain their value better than battery vehicles, which again is unsurprising considering the gravity of the technological change for the pure battery electric vehicle. The second thing is that luxury vehicles hold their value much better. And the reason for that is electric vehicle batteries are expensive, and consumers in luxury segments have a much higher capacity to pay. So range is essentially a premium feature on electric vehicles right now. If you would like high range, you're going to have to pay a high price tag for it. Just like if you want really good performance, you're going to have to pay a really high price tag on that as well. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the small compacts like Fiat, smart cars, things like that. And those do bad. Even with the price adjusted MSRP after 1 year, they lose half their value in the first year. An interesting outlier though is Tesla. So after the first year, they're above 90%. And they bucked the trend for a few reasons. So the first is they had a residual value retention program for a long time, where they guaranteed residual values simply to inspire confidence in the brand and encourage uptake of their product. But that ended in 2016, and looking at that event in the data and trying to do like an event study to figure out if it impacted, they really didn't. They have very high residual values. There's a ton of demand for them, and also the over-the-air wireless update, I think, keeps their models fresher than others over time. Toyota is an interesting example here because it's really the only non-luxury manufacturer where their battery-only electric vehicles are in the 70%, and that's because of the RAV4, the all-electric RAV4. And that speaks to a broader trend, which is going through the industry overall, is that trucks and SUVs are extremely popular, and that's also reflected in the EV space, right? So the compact utility, which is the RAV4, and then the luxury midsize, which is the Tesla Model X, those two battery-only electric vehicles, they really stand out on the retention scale. And then looking at the intermediate compacts and subcompacts, they do very poorly, right? So it's just as much of a segment issue as it is luxury versus non-luxury. So I think that when you look at aggregated electric vehicle residual value measures, a lot of that downward pressure is simply because of a more general shift in consumer demand in the US over time, irrespective of the drive type of the vehicle. So this chart reflects what I believe to be one of the most important trends in the auto industry in the US. And it shows the percentage of total sales that go to the new sales that go to the truck and SUV category. And in the 70s, it was about 20% of new sales for trucks and SUVs. And as of today, it's about 2/3. But the point about this graph is that it trends upwards over time. And the only eras where it deviated from that trend were high price. Were time periods of high prices. So high prices are often attributed to the recent uptick in truck and SUV sales, but that's been going on irrespective of the fuel prices and other time periods for a very long time. So a lot of what you see when you see Nissan Leafs or Fiat selling for a third 20 to 30% of MSRP after 3 years. A lot of that is a function of the body, just the segment of the car, over and above the fuel type barrier that people have into that space. So another factor that could depress prices is the range of vehicles. So consumers are said to have range anxiety, where even though 95% of trips in the US are under 30 miles, consumers express a nervousness about getting in a car that the battery could potentially die on a road trip, or if they're left without a charging station, that they could be stranded. But when you look at the cohorts of model years over time, range has been improving. So you see that back in 2012, the average range was about 120 miles on pure battery vehicles, and in 2017, it crept up to about 140. And that's a function of reduced battery costs. So battery costs fell by more than 77% between 2010 and 2016, and that allows more range at a cheaper price. And that's reflected here in the green line, which is MSRP per electric mile. So not only has the range been improving, but the price that consumers pay for the extra mile of range is declining as well. That's actually declined pretty significantly from about $240 in the 2012 model year cohort down to about $160 in the 2017 model year cohort. Currently, the cost of a battery is estimated to be around $227 per kilowatt hour. And a McKinsey study suggests that $100 per kilowatt hour is what's needed to make electric vehicles competitive with combustion engines. And that's forecasted to be achieved out in 2030. But I think that if you look at the far right blue bar, so for the 2017 Chevy Bolt, I think that the Bolt and the Tesla Model 3 are going to usher in a new era of electric vehicles simply because they offer a lot of range at a cheap cost. So I think that the green MSRP per electric mile line being around $150, I think that's a fairly good indication of where we're headed in the market. And the cost, the dollar per kilowatt estimates from other sources suggest that we can go below that as well. But the increase in range raises the question of how much of the low residual values in earlier model years is due to range compared to other factors. And using our auto cycle model, we can estimate the marginal impact of an extra mile of range on a battery-powered vehicle and a plug-in hybrid vehicle. And we can perform a thought experiment to try to figure out just how much the range matters on the used vehicle market. So here we have in the gray line a baseline economic forecast for the 2017 Versa. And on the x-axis, now instead of age, we have time, so calendar year. And then on the blue line, we have the forecast for a 2017 Nissan Leaf with a range of 107. So the Nissan Leaf is one of the worst performers in the EV space in terms of residual value. So as you can see, the gap between that and the Versa is about 15 to 20 percentage points at any given point in time. But because we decompose the price of the Leaf into stuff about the Leaf, stuff about the economy, and then the range, we can perform thought experiments where we say, okay, suppose that the Leaf range was doubled to 214. What would that residual value curve look like? And that's shown here in the shift from the blue line to the green line. So a doubling in the Leaf range adds about 5 percentage points of MSRP to it. If you're really generous and you want to say, okay, what happens if the Leaf has 3 times more range at the same price point? Then you get about 10 percentage points of MSRP back. So that's significant. But the takeaway here is that other forces in the economy weighing on the Leaf are more important than range, right? So even if in a lot of these subcompacts like the BMW i3 or the Leaf or the Mitsubishi Miev, like even if you could get the range on those very high, the quantitative evidence from the model suggests that that's not going to be enough to make the residual values comparable with other cars in the same class. So low ranges do have a downward pressure on retention value. They're less desirable to consumers. But even if the counterexample of the same cars with increased ranges, even if you increase those ranges, you still don't get to a level comparable to gas vehicles in the same segment. So the other huge factor for electric vehicles is gas prices, right? Simple economics would suggest that when gas prices get very high, that consumers substitute into cars that are cheaper to operate based on fuel, right? So in the graph that showed the new truck and SUV sales over time, that's why you see this resurgence in sedan and subcompact sales, because consumers demand them more because they're cheaper to run, right? You'd expect the same trend to happen in the electric vehicle space. So the graph on the screen shows in the blue line the average gasoline price in the US over time. The orange and the green lines show the percentage point difference between the electric vehicle residual value and a gas-powered vehicle's residual value. So the average for the entire market. So the way to read that is, back in 2014, that battery electric vehicles, their residual values were on average about 17 to 18 percentage points less than the average price to MSRP ratio on gas vehicles sold during that time. And there are two extremely interesting trend patterns that show on this figure. So the first is that after gas prices spiked after gas prices fell after 2014, you see this huge depression in battery electric vehicle gas prices to the point where that gap, or that spread between electric vehicle residual values and gas residual values, it widened. Similarly to the way that bond spreads widen, it widened by about 15 percentage points. So the gap became 30 percentage points in total. And as gas prices slowly crept upwards over time, that gap has been narrowing, right? But there's a very distinct drop once gas prices fell in early 2015. The orange line shows the same residual value spread, but for plug-in hybrid vehicles. And I find this very interesting because plug-in hybrid vehicles, they have much better fuel efficiency. They're cheaper to operate than gas-powered vehicles, but you don't see the same massive shift in substitution. You see it a little bit. You see about a 5 percentage point drop in the spread, and then it creeps upward over time as well. But the evidence suggests that battery-powered electric vehicles are very, very sensitive to swings in oil prices in the U.S. economy. So given that low oil prices depress battery electric vehicles by about 15 percentage points in that last graph, an interesting thought experiment would be, okay, what would gas prices have to be in order for the depreciation rate to match that of a gas-powered vehicle in a similar segment? So here we have the Nissan Leaf and the Nissan Versa again, where the blue line is the baseline forecast for the Nissan Leaf, and the gray line is the baseline forecast for the Nissan Versa. And then with our auto cycle model, we conducted what's called a sensitivity analysis. So we shocked gas prices by 1 standard deviation, which is the green line 1SD. We shocked it by 2 standard deviations, and we shocked it by 3 standard deviations, and tried to figure out how high would gas prices have to be in order for the Leaf to match the Versa. And the sensitivity analysis shows that the Leaf is more, and this can be extrapolated to electric vehicles more broadly, but battery-powered electric vehicles, their prices are more sensitive to gas prices than they are to range. And that's a simple argument of economics based on the cost of operation, the relative cost of operation between different vehicles on the market. But the 3 standard deviation shock, the purple line, the one that manages to save the Leaf and get it to depreciate at the same rate as the Versa, those are gas prices at the level that they were in 2014, so before 2015. So another implication of this is that unless there were to be some massive upward spike in gas prices, that cars like the Nissan Leaf, no matter how much you improve their range, that the economic forces that are depressing the segment overall, and then the oil price shock that's encouraging the substitution away from a more fuel-efficient alternative, that those are the predominant forces that will keep residual values low. So the range sensitivity analysis shows you can get about 10 percentage points of range from price MSRP ratio from increasing the range, but it's really the gas price shock that would be the biggest boon for battery electric vehicles. So what do our macroeconomic models suggest that gas prices are going to do in the future? And the answer is stay low. Gas prices have crept up a little bit since the Hurricanes Harvey and Hurricane Irma, but our baseline forecast is no growth in gas prices. So that downward pressure on battery-powered electric vehicle prices is going to persist for some time. And it's also worth noting that the low gas prices also depress new electric vehicle sales as well. So I know that the mandate by the Obama administration, the goal was to get, I think it was 1 million electric vehicles by 2015. And the top explanation for why we hit about half of that a year later is because of the gas price shock. So gas prices theoretically are a non-negligible force for electric vehicle adoption, and empirically, the data and models suggest that it matters quite a bit, and that the future of low oil prices is something that electric vehicle manufacturers and lessors and lenders should be aware of. Now, it's not to say the baseline forecast is infallible. There's always a chance for upward pressure. In particular, if OPEC doesn't boost production next year, or if the instability in the Kurdish region of Iraq or Libya, if the geopolitical instability, right, that could always lead to an upward shock. But our baseline forecast suggests that these price pressures are here to stay for some time. So how have cohorts of electric vehicles performed? So here I group the unique set of model years, of 2012 model years, 2013 model years, 2014, so on and so forth. And I calculate their average price MSRP ratio over time. So this gives you a sense of, this is an attempt to decompose some of those economic factors and some of the factors relating to range improvements and price cannibalization because of innovation. And so the different cohorts of battery electric vehicles have been, the retention values have been fairly stable over time. The one outlier is the 2015 cohort, which we demonstrated that the market overall got crushed when gas prices fell. So you see that that was definitely a shock to that group of vehicles. But given these forces, what do we expect the outlook for electric vehicle prices to look like? And to do that, again, I leverage our auto cycle model. So this breaks out the unique set of battery electric vehicles by model year, and looks at their residual values over their age in terms of months. Here I use an assumption of 5,800 miles per year, simply because that's the average for electric vehicles. They're driven less, probably as a function of their lower range. And this shows, if you compare the 2012 vintage life cycle curve to the 2015 year model cohort, you see that downward pressure that we saw in the last graph, right? So that was because of the oil price shock. But if you look at the light blue and the purple line, those are the forecasts for the 2016 and 2017 battery electric vehicle cohorts. And the notable thing is that they are flatter than the other curves, meaning that they're going to retain their value better than previous vintages. The level starts lower simply because there's so much, because of the oil price pressure and some of the segment pressures right now. But forecasting forward for those vintages, we expect them to hold their value better. And by 3 years, they're going to end up a little better than the 2014 and 2015 vintages, comparable to the 2013 vintage at 3 years old. And that's largely a function of the innovation that's happening in the sector. There's vehicles with higher ranges, right? So that gives some upward pressure. The gas price shock was greatest for the 2015 cohort, but even though that those levels, that gas prices have stayed low, they've been creeping up and they're going to level off. But that initial shock was most impactful for that cohort. So the marginal impact on recent cohorts is going to be less. But by no means does this mean that electric vehicle residual values are all of a sudden going to become very strong and comparable to gas-powered vehicles. The analysis earlier with the gas price sensitivity analysis shows that unless gas prices were to do something crazy and out of the ordinary, that the residual values are still going to be low, but there's going to be small gains going forward as the market matures and the technology improves. The plug-in hybrid electric vehicles on a cohort by cohort basis over time, they show a little different pattern. So there's steady improvement over time. And for the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, again, the barrier to entry on the consumer side isn't as high. I think that the value proposition for a consumer in a world with very low gas prices is a lot higher for the plug-in electric vehicles, simply because the electric battery is kind of like an add-on, right? Is you essentially get a hybrid car that has some extra functionality that ekes out more range or more efficiency. And there's been a much more steadier improvement of those residual values over time. And using our auto cycle model and doing the same exercise, grouping plug-in hybrid electric vehicles by model year cohort and forecasting forward, there's not as much variation between the model years, which reflects in that last graph using the raw AuctionNet data, that they've been much steadier over time. And then also the 2016 and 2017 model years here, again, the depreciation curve is flatter. And looking out at the 3-year mark, those cohorts are forecasted to be the best model years in terms of residual value retention that we've seen yet. Not comparing to the 2012 cohort, which was before the gas price fall. So another thing that's extremely important that I alluded to earlier was the existence of consumer, I don't want to call them consumer friendly, but affordable electric vehicles with good range that are outside of the luxury segment. That again, if we think back to the manufacturer and segment graphs that I showed earlier, the market's really bifurcated. You have extremely luxury vehicles where they can afford to make really good ranges, a premium feature, and then you have smaller vehicles where they're better suited for maybe city commuting or commuting from the suburbs. But the existence of the Bolt and the Model 3 in the future, I think, is going to be a boon for the industry. And using our auto cycle model by decomposing the Bolt into all of its constituent features and comparing that forecast to the 2018 Corolla and the 2018 Leaf, the Bolt is expected to do very well. So again, this MSRP is adjusted for the federal tax credit, but at 3 years, the model suggests that it's about 70% of MSRP, which off of sticker MSRP, that would probably be about 50 to 55%. But it's significantly better than the Corolla, which is obviously gas powered. And then compared to the Nissan Leaf, it's head and shoulders above it. And again, the preceding analysis suggested about 10 percentage points of that is range. Another bit is from the segment, right? And the Chevy brand carries a marginal effect as well. But the Bolt really has an opportunity to succeed both on the new market and also its residual values are forecasted to be very good as well. And it's also interesting to compare the Chevy Bolt compared to the Tesla Model S. So the Model S is notoriously one of the best performing EV cars in residual value retention for the reasons that I explained before. But looking forward in time, so looking forward to 2018, 2019, 2020, it looks like the Bolt is going to outperform the Model S according to our forecast by about 10 percentage points. And that the Model S is going to start to approximate others in the near luxury category, such as the Audi A3. And the primary reason for that is we are coming to the very late stages of our expansion. So our baseline forecasts have things like the unemployment rate starting to deteriorate a little bit after late 2018 as we start to come down the other side of that business cycle. And what our forecast suggests is that the Model S, being a luxury vehicle, is much more sensitive to those macroeconomic fluctuations. So I think that the timing of the Bolt, in terms of its technological innovation and like very favorable market presence, is good, because that kind of vehicle is going to be very desirable as the economy maybe starts cooling off from this long expansion that we've had. So in conclusion, we've decomposed the effects on electric vehicle residual values into a couple different parts, right? So you have, when you look at that life cycle function, you have the acceleration after year one, and that is mostly attributed to innovation, so model years with improved ranges, and then also to battery degradation. It's just those first 50,000 miles are much harder on the price valuation than compared to a regular gas-powered vehicle or even a plug-in hybrid vehicle. Given the current state of the electric vehicle market, things like infrastructure and battery technology, and the relative price tag on pure battery electric vehicles compared to similar gas-powered vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles will continue to do well. There's less of a barrier entry to consumers. They're very fuel efficient. And also they can still leverage existing gas and oil infrastructure. The BEV market is going to continue to mature. However, our forecast suggests that that maturity is going to happen slowly in the absence of an oil price shock. That those technological factors are important, but they're probably only worth about 10 percentage points of MSRP. Again, we're at an inflection point in this market. I think that there's a lot of promise, and these are very exciting times, but the price cannibalization is definitely something to be aware of. And it's also the case that early adopters of bleeding edge technology, that is to be expected to some degree, right? Anybody who bought the very first iPhone, they can't expect it to hold its value after the 10th version comes out, right? But it's something to be aware of quantitatively when you're assessing things like collateral value risk and residual value risk going forward. The segment shifts, the shifts in segments in the U.S., the segment preferences in the U.S. over time, they will continue to weigh on EVs overall. And I think just looking at the cool stuff at the pictures from the LA Auto Show, it looks like OEMs are heeding that advice. And it looks like a lot of their first electric vehicles are going to be compact utilities or sport utility vehicles, which in the U.S., given long-term historical trends, seems to be a must going forward. The mass market cars like the Bolt and Model 3, I think that they're really going to redefine the paradigm for EVs going forward, and they hold a lot of potential, especially considering how cheap range is getting with advancements in battery technology, and that will also lead to their cannibalization getting worse. My hypothesis would be that cannibalization is worse for very low range residual values, that going from 100-mile range to a 120-mile range or 150-mile range, that impact would be much more than going from 220 to 270. I haven't tested that, but that's what my expectation would be. So they should just retain their value better, more, not only in terms of their range, but in terms of their kind of robustness to succeeding innovation. And just in the EV markets overall, there should be good progress going forward. I think the zero emission vehicle regulation in California and 9 other states which mandate a certain amount of electric vehicles be sold for every gas-powered vehicle. Those will encourage innovation and force costs to come down and force infrastructure building. But I think that with the GOP tax plan moving forward, the federal tax credit is up in the air, and that has the potential to slow things down. So there's these competing forces going forward, both of which influence not only the new market, which is where they're obviously tailored towards, but there's network effects throughout the used market as well, where increased innovation in infrastructure, in charging infrastructure, and increased consumer awareness on the new space, that flows over to the used market as well. So I think the two things go hand in hand. All right, so that's the conclusion of my presentation. And Nick, I believe that we're going to start the Q&A.
Absolutely. Excellent presentation, Michael. A lot of great information and data to consider. And it's just a reminder, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll make the recording and presentation available to you as soon as possible so you could revisit the points that Michael has shared, and as well as disseminate the analysis at your shop to craft your strategy accordingly. And if you have any questions, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to them during the remainder of our time together. And Michael, to get us started, you referenced it a bit at the very tail end of your presentation, and as well as at the opening segment, and as well as throughout your presentation and in the notes section of your slides, the tax credit that's available, and certainly there is quite a debate happening in Washington right now regarding tax reform, and the analysis you shared included that $7,500 federal tax credit for electric vehicles. If in fact lawmakers in Congress, especially on the House side, repeal that potential tax credit, how much will that impact your analysis if that component is no longer a part of the scenario?
Sure. So economic theory would dictate that it would decrease demand, right? Because it acts as an implicit increase in price. But it's hard to know exactly, simply because we haven't lived in a world without that tax credit yet on the EV space. That's been the norm for so long. But Georgia is an interesting case where in 2015, they rescinded their state tax credit, and new electric vehicle sales fell by 90%. So it's tempting, I think, to look at that and start to sound the alarms that it would be this dramatic collapse of the electric vehicle industry, but I don't think that's the case. And the reason is because the tax credit isn't on a sliding scale with respect to MSRP, it's going to impact cheaper cars more than it is more expensive, right? So if you get rid of that tax credit on a tiny car, like maybe a Nissan Leaf, that could, in percentage terms, that could be a huge price increase. But on a Tesla, that's really not that much. So it could affect smaller cars more than larger cars, and it would definitely push consumers on the margin who are interested in adopting electric vehicle technology. So I think it would decrease demand, but the zero emission vehicle regulation in the 10 other states, I think that would do a lot to offset it, simply because that would force manufacturers to find a way to make electric vehicles profitable, simply because they must sell them, right? I mean, it could be painful for a while, simply because a lot of the incentive to purchase a new EV just vanished, right? But I think that would be offset slightly by the innovation that would have to take place to meet that regulatory requirement.
The voice you're hearing, that's Michael Vogon, who is the lead auto economist at Moodys Analytics and the special guest for our webinar today, where we're discussing the electric vehicle residual value outlook. And Michael, another question that's come in, another element that could impact outlooks in the future is it's easy to find a gas station to refuel a combustion engine vehicle, but with the increase in charging infrastructure and how to keep these electric vehicles powered, how might that impact future analysis and outlook for these kinds of vehicles as the proliferation of charging infrastructure increases?
Yeah, so charging infrastructure is definitely an important factor. I would have loved to put that in the model, but it's hard to quantify in a systematic way for forecasting. But yeah, that's incredibly important. I mean, personally, I'd be interested in buying an electric vehicle, but there's some logistical hurdles you have to overcome with regards to the accessibility, right? The pricing, right? Is it a subscription type membership fee? Can you just go up and plug your car in? Like there's all sorts of variables that would stimulate demand greatly, both on the new side and the used side. But the thing about charging infrastructure is very much a chicken and egg problem. It's like you want robust and widespread charging infrastructure to encourage EV adoption, but you'd also like EV adoption before you make the large investment. And I think that in California is a good example of that, where they have the nation's highest EV penetration. They also have robust infrastructure to support it. But another important thing there is that most EVs are charged at home. So for commuters, I think that's not as big of a barrier. But for anybody who wants the flexibility of being able to take their electric vehicle outside of their hometown or to another state, I think that the charging infrastructure network becomes more of a desirable feature for them.
Again, the voice you're hearing, that's Michael Vogon, who is the lead auto economist at Moodys Analytics, and we're discussing the residual value outlook for electric vehicles. And if you have questions for Michael, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And Michael, several questions have arrived about the same subject regarding the batteries in these units. If you could just revisit your thoughts on how the cost of that piece of the vehicle is going to influence the outlook for residual values for electric vehicles, how the supply of batteries could help these vehicles, as well as the raw materials that go into these batteries, lithium and other components that could possibly impact the cost of production. Just again, if you could revisit the ingredients that are going into battery production and how it's already impacted your outlook and how it might be going forward.
Absolutely. So the battery piece mostly influences residual values in terms of range, right? That when you cite the McKinsey study with the cost per kilowatt hour decreasing from $227 to $100 over the next 10 to 15 years, that's the primary way that will help residual values is in terms of increasing range, right? And they'll also help new car sales and helping consumers overcome that initial range anxiety. But in respect to the battery degradation, I'm not quite sure how much of the technological innovation has been in making more robust batteries, but I'm sure that's definitely something that OEMs have their eye on, simply because most warranties for electric vehicles, they cover normal wear and tear, right? And the fact is that there's a lot of variables that can influence how fast a battery deteriorates, right? Like how much you charge the battery at any given point in time, how frequently you cycle the battery. So to the extent that manufacturers are experiencing abnormal battery degradation, then that will also be a focus of their battery innovation in the future.
Excellent. Again, the voice you're hearing, that's Michael Vogon, who is the lead auto economist at Moodys Analytics, and we're in our webinar today, reviewing the residual value outlook for electric vehicles. And just a reminder that we are recording today's webinar, and we'll make the recording and presentation available as soon as possible, so you can review the great information, data, and analysis that Michael has shared with us. And if you do have any questions, please use the questions box on the platform, and we'll use our closing moments here to get to them. And Michael, as you kind of touched on again already with regard to the transition and the proliferation of battery electric vehicles as well as plug-in hybrids, you referenced California and other places are looking to increase the volume of fleet that's on the road nowadays, transitioning toward electric vehicles. Again, how will those components go into impacting residual values as the market demands more electric vehicles, as well as potentially lawmakers and other factors pushing the increase of these kinds of vehicles on the road?
Yeah, so I think that one of the more important policy changes that is going to happen over the next year is related to the zero-emission vehicle regulation that's in California and 9 other states. So basically, thus far, the way those states have adopted that regulation is there's a travel provision, which means that OEMs can meet their quota as long as they deploy the right amount of electric vehicles to any of the states that have signed up. So basically, evidence suggests that what's happened is that California's gotten the lion's share of those cars, and the other states that signed on are secondary artifacts. But that provision is going to go away starting next year, and I think it's going to force OEMs to build brand awareness in those 9 other states, a lot of which are in the Northeast, so states like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and it's going to force them to create a market there, essentially. And if demand can be stimulated to absorb those cars, then I think that we're going to start to break that chicken and egg cycle, right? Then it's going to justify more infrastructure, then it's going to justify innovation and development in those places. Because with a nascent technology like this, the reason that regulation is applied and tax credits are given is because it's been determined that because of climate change, right, and oil dependency, that there's a socially suboptimal number of electric vehicles in the United States. So policy is extremely important in getting us to that optimal level. And the observation is that that policy isn't uniform at the federal level, it's scattered across the country. So I think that we're going to see asymmetric development in different electric vehicle markets throughout the US within the coming years.
And again, the voice you're hearing, that's Michael Vogon, who is the lead auto economist at Moodys Analytics, discussing the residual value outlook for electric vehicles. And Michael, in our closing moments here, referencing another segment of Moodys Analytics offerings that the firm is expecting growth to moderate in late 2019 and into 2020 with the potential for possibly a recession in that time frame. And looking down the road, if we assume nothing drastic happens to gas prices before then, if they remain relatively stable, what might be the potential economic impact of a recession if it happens on electric vehicle prices? Might those assets be more or less sensitive to economic shocks than gas-powered vehicles? If you could, to wrap us up, just looking further down the road, just a potential recession, other economic factors on what could influence electric vehicles down the road.
Sure. So electric vehicles are more sensitive to macroeconomic fluctuations than other vehicles. And the reason for that is, even though that they require less maintenance and their cost of ownership is lower than a gas-powered vehicle, their upfront sticker cost is high, right? So if you assume that the tax credit goes away, it gets even higher. And then moving forward in time, if there's worst case a recession, medium case a slowdown in growth, it's very hard to imagine consumers adopting an expensive cutting edge technology under those conditions. Yeah, especially in the luxury segment, such as Teslas and the Mercedes electric vehicles. I mean, even though those do great now, those are historically pretty volatile. That being said, the substitution between new car markets and used car markets can be interesting and perplexing at times. So you could see, because residual values on used electric vehicles are so low, that 2014 Nissan Leaf is an awesome deal right now, right? You could see that as an affordable choice during times of economic stress, right? So overall, they're more sensitive, but you could see the substitution between the two types of markets.
That's Michael Vogon, the lead auto economist at Moodys Analytics. Michael, thank you so much for the great data analysis and insights involving electric vehicles.
All right, thank you, Nick.
And for more economic insights into auto residuals and other risk, you can visit the site there on your screen, moodysanalytics.com/auto. And again, be on the lookout for a recording of today's presentation that you can review the data and analysis that's been shared. For my Cherokee Media Group colleagues, Maura Framian and Matt Rice, I'm Nick Zulovich. Thank you so much for joining us.